Joanna, good to have you on the program. Welcome.
Hi, Patrick. Good morning. I had heard something that was troubling to me, and I wanted an answer. And I looked for the answer, through the internet, but I didn't see anything. There was a statement made on the radio about when the Democrats were doing their convention, a bus full of nuns and priests, Jesuit priests, were in the bus, and their statement was that we need to vote for Biden because he is Catholic, and as Catholics we should stand behind him. Mm-hmm. And I thought that very confusing.
Yes.
So I want to know if there's any truth.
All right, let's parse this out a little bit. Okay, I can help you. Okay, so the first thing to keep in mind is there are Catholics, bishops, priests, nuns, lay people, who are, I want to choose my words carefully here, who are very committed to the Democratic Party. And historically, we can say that in the United States, at least, the Democratic Party for a long time, it was the party that seemed to be the most simpatico with many Catholics, especially working Catholics in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, when there were immoral tactics that were used by big businesses and wealthy people to kind of rip off the common guy. So trade unions and other forms of unions were very much at the heart of this affiliation with the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party promoted those very strongly, and that coincided with the promotion of similar things by popes, such as Pope Leo, for example, Leo the 13th. This would be at the end of the 19th century. So historically, we can see that there has been a kind of affiliation, but we shouldn't neglect to point out that if you go back far enough, you see that during the time of the Civil War, it was the Republicans under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln who advocated most strongly for abolition, and it was the Democrats who were fiercely opposed to abolition of slaves, and they were the ones who strongly opposed the efforts to have a peaceful Reconstruction and a reintegration of the southern states back into the Union, and to make sure that all black people had the vote, and that they had the opportunity to do what any other citizen in this country would have the opportunity to do. It was the Democratic Party that consistently opposed that in those years, in the middle part of the 19th century and forward. This is why, for example, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who died within the last, 10 years or so, he himself is a very stalwart Democrat. He was also at one time a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So there's a long entangled history here. It's not easy to say, well, it's all this or it's all that. But when you take all that into account, you see that by the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the Catholic Church in the United States seemed more or less to be strongly affiliated with the Democratic Party. And then along about the 1970s, especially as we get to the point of Roe versus Wade, then we see the beginning of a decided shift in the plank of the Democratic Party. It's well documented, for example, Joanna, that the Kennedy family, John F. Kennedy himself, not to mention Robert F. Kennedy and Senator Edward Kennedy, who lived far longer than the others did, they were all pro-life. And it was, among others, Jesuit priests who made visits out to their Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and they would spend the weekend with them, spend days with them, and essentially they deprogrammed their pro-life sensibilities as Catholics to conform to being what is currently known now as being pro-choice. And I'll make sure that we get a link posted to an article that details all of this quite exhaustively. But the point is, there was a shift in the party, and in the 1970s, we began seeing a lot of things in the Democratic Party that were contrary, antithetical even, to things that they espoused before, and the rise of abortion and all the money to be made there. So that's a bit of a long preamble to get to the answer to your question, but without having some historical background, it's hard to make sense of this. Why are some people still so enamored of the Democratic Party, especially as Catholics, when it stands for and proudly promotes things that are deeply antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ? You know, abortion being an example of that, perhaps the most urgent example. So I don't know how to explain, you know, not only the different reasons why the Democratic Party changed, but it's not for me to judge or to know how somebody can try to reconcile support for abortion with these other issues. But I wonder if some of this stems from longstanding party affiliation. Well, my father was a Democrat, and his father was a Democrat, and his father was a Democrat. We've always been Democrats. It could be something like that. There could also be, perhaps, a desire to promote a more liberal agenda, and by telling people it's okay to vote for a candidate who stands for X, Y, or Z. If you find that offensive, don't worry, because, hey, he's a Catholic. So prescinding from candidates and parties and such, and I have to be very forthright with you, I'm not here to promote or bash any political candidate. I'm not here to promote or bash any political party, and I don't want to do that, and I'm not going to do that. But we can speak about principles and issues, regardless of party, regardless of candidate, regardless of election. And there are certain perennial principles that always and everywhere apply. Now, I'll give you one little more tidbit here, Joanna, of detail that might help you understand this. You remember the former Cardinal McCarrick, Theodore McCarrick. Now he's Mr. McCarrick, and he's living out the remainder of his days in obscurity somewhere as a very old man. But he was formerly one of the most, if not the most powerful cardinals in the hierarchy of the United States bishops. And he, as you know, he was doing a lot of bad things, immoral things on the side. Lots of accusations against him of sodomy and other sodomitic practices with men. And so eventually all caught up with him, and he was bounced, and now he's been laicized. However, when he was still a cardinal, during the time of Pope Benedict XVI, when this issue was coming up again and again during the election cycles, Pope Benedict XVI, who previously was Cardinal Ratzinger, wrote a letter to the U.S. bishops telling them, as Pope, not to support candidates who promote abortion. And then Cardinal McCarrick, first of all, he lied about its contents, and he misstated, he misrepresented. In fact, almost exactly the opposite of what Pope Benedict had instructed the bishops. He said almost exactly the opposite, and he refused to release the letter. Now, eventually, the letter did come out, and only later did people realize that, far from Pope Benedict XVI saying, yes, it's okay if you feel that there's a greater good here, you can support this candidate or that candidate who promotes abortion. It's not what Pope Benedict said, and Theodore McCarrick lied through his teeth about it. Why did he do that? I don't know. But in the process, it confused a lot of rank-and-file Catholics who heard that and said, oh, okay, well, I guess I can do X, Y, or Z, when in fact that's not what the Pope had said. Now, there's more to that story, but that figures into this as well. So without talking about candidates or parties, we must, however, look at what does the gospel say about things like poverty. And although the gospel doesn't really speak in any great detail about racism, what about that? What about refugees? What about healthcare? What about people of all categories who need our assistance, whether they're poor or whether they have some other disadvantage? The gospel says we are to do what we can to try to help them. But there's a hierarchy of important issues. Now, jaywalking may be a real problem in your neighborhood, but jaywalking is not as important of a problem. It's important, but it's not as important of a problem as people who are dying of starvation because they don't have access to food or clean water. That's a much more important issue. And maybe the candidate who's really good about jaywalking and can get the jaywalking fixed quickly doesn't have much of a plan when it comes to poverty, So although jaywalking might be an important issue locally, there are higher and more important issues. And the same is true of abortion. And the U.S. bishops have reminded us of this repeatedly, most recently at their plenary meeting that they had, I believe it was last October, if I'm not mistaken. So when it comes to kind of parsing between different issues, we have to remember that the so-called seamless garment theory is false. This notion that all of these moral issues have the same equal weight, that's false. You will find people who will tell you, no. Poverty and immigration, abortion and all these other things, they all have more or less the same equal weight. That's not true for the following reasons. The church has always taught that there are matters of what is known as prudential judgment. This is sort of a trendy term that's used a lot nowadays, prudential judgment. What that means is that people of goodwill who are appealing to divine revelation and right reason, and even if they don't accept divine revelation, if they at least are using right reason to arrive at a legitimate solution to a problem, the church says that there can be a variety of different possibilities, and it's up to those of goodwill who are trying to accommodate these problems to find a good resolution. So prudential judgment means, in your best judgment, what do you think is the right solution to this problem? And that can apply to poverty and to taxes and to the border and to many things. But it's not something that applies to abortion, because abortion is always and everywhere wrong. It is intrinsically evil. So there is no way to accommodate that. There's no way to say, well, in your prudential judgment, what do you think would be the best approach to abortion? The church's answer is ironclad and it's airtight, and it's don't do it. It's always wrong. There's never a scenario where abortion is okay. And so for a candidate to say, well, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I'm not going to get in the way of people who do it, that's just a cop-out, regardless of what that person's religion may be. And to me, as a Catholic, it's all the more egregious when it's a Catholic who says things like that, because it's nonsense. It would be the functional equivalent of saying, well, I'm personally opposed to slavery, but I'm not going to try to stop anybody from owning slaves. Ridiculous. If you're personally opposed to it, and if it's wrong, you should oppose it. And if you don't oppose it, then one would have to ask, why aren't you opposing it? Could it be a little campaign cash on the side, maybe helping you get reelected? Who knows what the possibilities might be. So as we approach the coming election, as we will other elections in the future, I encourage you to get in touch with us at Relevant Radio. In fact, this is a good reminder that if you haven't made a pledge yet, Joanna, you can always go to relevantradio.com or the Relevant Radio app and make a pledge that way, and you'll receive from Father Rocky a digital download that will guide you as a Catholic through these moral principles, so that when it comes time to cast your vote, you'll be able to vote with a clear conscience, and you'll be able to vote correctly according to the gospel. Thanks for the call. I'll be right back.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.